Hello and welcome to the Officio Spotlight podcast. My name is Simon Lipscomb and thanks for listening. As regular listeners will know, we've been using the last few of these podcasts to explore stories around the impact of COVID-19 on procurement and supply chain and businesses generally. In our last discussion, we were obviously very lucky to get the opportunity to speak with Jackie Rott, who is the Chief Commercial Officer at NHS Test and Trace. In today's podcast, I'm really excited to be joined by another one of the senior industry leaders that can absolutely say they've had a seat at the table at the very heart of the story of this pandemic, certainly within the UK. I imagine at times that seat has been challenging and stressful to say the least, but I think the story behind this team and its achievements are genuinely extraordinary and therefore deserve and should be told. So I'm delighted to be joined by Gary Horsfield, who is the Chief Operating Officer for the UK PPE at the Department of Health and Social Care and NHS. And perhaps for our listeners outside of the UK, Gary and his team have been responsible for acquiring and distributing personal protective equipment to the UK health and social care sector since the start of this pandemic. They've ordered 32 billion items, of which 8 billion have been delivered to date to 58,000 locations across the UK, built an entirely new online portal, allowing frontline workers to place direct orders, which has delivered billion items itself, as well as creating a UK PPE manufacturing capability almost from scratch. And as a result of that, has created 2,500 jobs. So I'm delighted Gary has taken his time to share his story with me. As before, in the interest of transparency, that we as Officio, myself and an individual, have been working with the team on PPE. So in that sense, we are not objective in this discussion. But to kind of start our conversation, I thought it would be useful to wind the clock back actually to the start of this pandemic, where, we had this new virus that had emerged. Very little was known about it other than it was spreading frighteningly fast and people around the world were dying. And so much was unknown. And the burning platform was PPE, right? You had NHS Frontline being asked to literally put themselves on the front line. And in order to do that, they needed the PPE. And then a team of people were asked to turn up to an unassuming office building in Elephant and Castle and kind of solve this problem. Be interested to understand the start of your journey, really, how you came into this.
I was like many, I guess, a frustrated supply chain guy sat at home, basically planning the supply chain of my next day in the middle of the biggest global supply chain crisis around the world. And you, as an individual, you feel like there must be somebody somewhere that wants my skills, even for a short period of time. So I got a phone call on a Saturday morning and started on Monday, the 27th of April. As you say, right in the middle of the, what was a very visible global crisis. I mean, some of the indices were, 1,500 times original demand for products around the world in light of a pandemic and a virus that was quickly being understood, but that was almost being revealed daily. With PPE, the interesting thing is success for us is not being recognized, unlike the other programs that you've talked about, which are obviously pretty key. Ours is a supply chain that should just work, and at the time it couldn't cope with the demand. So walking into that environment was quite amazing. It was the ultimate emergency global supply chain crisis, and one that now, as we reflect back, you mentioned some of the numbers, we've successfully managed to now be not visible because we are delivering on a daily basis to 50,000 outlets that we now go to, with on average, I think it's something like 30 million items a day. And as you say, we're now in February. So at the end of April, we were obviously on the news for not being able to do that. So that's quite some turnaround in a very short space of time. It's a fantastic journey, right? For me, you often get chances in your career to do a supply chain transformation. It's very rare that you get a chance to start something from scratch and basically bring in every element of any transformation you've ever done all at the same time. The solutions are simple. Putting them all together and making them work is the hard bit, but great fun for a professional.
To that point, Gary, I mean, where on earth did you start? You walked into this building, you understood supply chain. What was the plan?
Unfortunately, in such an emergency, you can't start at point A and at Z, right? We had to start at A, D, and F all at the same time. So the way we organized ourselves was secure supply. And at the time, most supply was on a global marketplace. It wasn't in the UK. At the same time, we started setting up a UK base. And you referenced in the introduction, we had about 1% PPE was coming out of the UK, which is not great. We made a commitment to hit 70% capability by the end of the year, which we exceeded, as well as securing the PPE, which was critical. It's then setting up a base for long-term resilience. And you can't do one without the other. There's no point in focusing on the long term and not delivering short term, particularly like this. So that allowed us to balance. The next thing was then actually build the supply chain to go deliver it, which again, you have to do at the same time. There's three big things during that crisis we did. It's buy, create, and then move were the three big initiatives that we stood up. And then very quickly, having got those established and starting to flow, you then move out. Almost by July, we'd moved out of emergency crisis into stabilize, right? So again, in the sequence of a transformation, you expect to move through phases, chunks of time. We were moving through them weeks at a time, which was quite amazing. And credit to everybody that's been through the program. I think we've had about 800 to 900 people come through this program over time, but they shifted gear and shifted direction based on what we were trying to achieve. So emergency to start off with into absolute stabilization, because that rush to buy then needs to be turned very quickly into smooth delivery and understand what people want. We're now, what are we, February? Look at the clock, April to February, and we're already thinking about how do you sustain this in a commercially viable way for a national supply chain, which is an incredible journey.
And just to kind of pick up on those two things you mentioned, the buy and the create and the move, again, winding it back to that April timeframe, I guess that buy thing must have been incredibly hard. We didn't have any manufacturing capability. The entire world wanted to buy basically the same items at the same time. What was that like?
Let's add another few factors like prices going through the roof, borders closing, shortage of containers and international freight, and a looming Brexit as well. We can chuck that into the mix as we were approaching this. So, like I say, you can approach these in many ways, but for me, it was the perfect challenge for a supply chain person. It was, everything, I wouldn't say everything you dream about, but everything you work through in your career all comes together in one way. And for me, sometimes it's just break each thing down into a clear objective, set the teams off, and they're all achievable. Every single one, when you break it down, is doable. As a whole, it looks incredibly daunting. But like I say, broken down with the right direction, each team can go and deliver. And then it's just the difficulty then is pulling it all together so that it lands. And that's effectively what we did. I've used simple terminology there of buy, create, move, but that is one of the easiest ways of breaking it down so people know what they're trying to achieve, right?
Yeah. And again, in terms of that experience of the create as well, must have been fascinating because, again, at least I can't think of another scenario where UK government has tried to drive a market like that. I mean, what was the response like from the market? Was it positive?
The response was overwhelming. The volume of offers for help was mind-blowing and incredible and almost too much to cope with. And sifting through those to find the right ones, the ones that could go and take us all the way, was as big a challenge as anything. And it's all based on goodwill and the desire to help, but it's just funneling that down under the banner of the need for speed and the need to be able to turn an offer into reality fairly quickly. I think we ended up with just over 2,000 jobs we created on PPE. I think through 31 main suppliers that stood up. Some were people that had shifted their business. Others were global businesses that were prepared to invest in the UK. The interesting thing for me, though, is not just about our ability to stand that up, and the crisis gives you license to do it, obviously, but you reflect back and you go, it was there to be done anyway. So the success of how it stood up and its viability as you look at it long term means that it just needed that trigger and it needed that effort behind it to now stand up what is a UK industry that, as far as I can see, has a long-term future and is very viable on the international stage. So again, sometimes out of the crisis comes some great things. As a program, that's one of the things we're most proud of. It's not just the response of UK industry, but the ability of UK industry to go from almost zero to something that you can see as long-term viable. And I talk about me standing my supply chain up in 6 or 7 months. These guys stood their factories up in the same period of time, which is equally as an amazing story. And all over the country, they've come from everywhere. Like I say, some repurposed, some invested from scratch. It's quite incredible seeing that product now flow through the system. And for me, for the customer base that we've got, part of the magic of the UK manufacturing industry is we've kind of put the kitchen in the middle of the restaurant. So when you buy on a global scale, it's difficult to see. And, there's a lot of talk about quality and acceptability of product within the system we work with. When you're coming from a UK manufacturer, people can see where it's coming from. They can see who's behind it. They trust how it works. And then you put together the Made in UK badge and the NHS badge. And like I say, you've got a hell of a proposition going forward.
Question I asked Jackie as well on the test and trace, but you and your team had these unprecedented challenges and pressures on you. I think anyone would accept have been quite amazing achievements, but at the same time, there's been public scrutiny, and it's a topic that was close to everyone's heart. From the press and other places, there's no shortage of views, opinions around PPE, the procurement of PPE, etc. I mean, without going into the specifics of that, but what's it like trying to manage a team under extraordinary pressure, but with this, I think, doing amazing work, but with this noise?
Well, let me start with the easy bit, right? So you search all your career to define purpose in what you do. And I've worked for some amazing organizations, don't get me wrong, but ultimately the world would carry on without them. Here, the purpose is super clear. For me as an individual, that just cuts through absolutely everything. Everybody absolutely knows what we're trying to deliver. And you talked about it at the start, there was a very visible crisis, and this needed to be a supply chain of work, not just trying to work. With that purpose, it's dead easy to get the organization aligned, and it's dead easy for everybody to turn up every day and understand what we're trying to deliver. That's great. Right. And internally, that's just unifies everybody to one direction, which is fantastic. And it's a hell of a motivator too. The frustrating thing is what you said, you never actually get credit for it, because unfortunately, two sides to it. One is it should work. Therefore, the fact that it works means you don't make the headlines. The desire to try and find out where we might have gone wrong is a little bit frustrating for the team. Whilst externally, it's very difficult to defend some of that stuff because it's often your lines don't get mentioned. But internally, people can see what we've done, and they can see that almost every day. And they can see that in the numbers that we produce. Success is being invisible, I guess. It's like I say, you don't celebrate that cash machine always gives you the right amount of money, you just expect it. Well, we're kind of that sort of supply chain, right? That people now expect. I guess our job now is just to build that ongoing confidence. Out of the crisis, what we built is something that is sustainable and here to stay. It's not going to go back to where it was. The industry that we've stood up, we should sustain, and that's fundamentally shifted everything on PPE front from where it was in January. I mean, it's very different now.
That's probably my next question is, obviously, you've been through this fire of unprecedented change and challenge. I mean, except everything about this pandemic is terrible, clearly. Will things look different? Are there positives? Where does this go from here, right? Is it different?
Yeah, I think so. You wouldn't wish the crisis on anything, and you wouldn't wish it again. But those sort of events allow you to do things and break what appears to be norms very quickly. I referenced, before, we stood up a UK industry that I think the assumption before we stood that up was that would cost money. It doesn't, and it didn't, and it is viable long term. There's myth bust number one. We've got a national supply chain that goes out to, as I say, 50,000 outlets with 30 million parts a day. And did you think you could do that in January? No. Have we done it? Yeah. What does that provide? It provides a massive UK spine upon which other healthcare products can build. That didn't exist in January. We brought a load of people in that are directly engaging with manufacturing, which has been part of the success story with the UK, but equally directly engaging with international manufacturers that are starting to build product that really work for our end users. That didn't exist in January. And I can keep going, but the speed at which the crisis allowed us to move, allowed us to break a lot of perceived unachievable events. If you'd have said in January, before all this kicked off, we would have a national supply chain that directly engaged heavily UK industry, but other industries, and provided products on a daily basis of that scale across healthcare, you'd have thought I was mad, right? So the challenge now is to show that the system, that it wasn't just because of the crisis, it was always possible. The crisis just gave us license to do it very quickly. And now what can we build off the back of it? Because your obvious question when you hear that is, well, what else? What else can you do? What else could the UK make? What else could you deliver nationally on a daily basis? What else could hitchhike off the back of what you've done? And now you're into a much bigger transformation. So, and in a system that hasn't shifted as fast as the private sector, the opportunity here for real supply chain advantage, as I say, with a solid purpose running through the middle of it, is quite incredible.
And what about you personally, Gary? So you were kind of parachuted in to the start of this crisis. You've had this kind of glittering corporate career. Have you enjoyed it? What's it been like?
Yeah, so it's funny. My kids say it's the most they've seen me enjoy myself. And I couldn't put my finger on it. Why? Because it is a difficult period of time to go through. But I guess, from a personal side, to really see the impact of what you do in such a short space of time, both professionally and personally, it's quite an incredible experience for anybody to go through. I think I enjoy change and transformation. I enjoy delivering that, but to do one of this scale that has such an impact is quite incredible. And to get the opportunity to do that within your career is not something maybe you thought you would. Yeah, that's incredibly rewarding. Now then, I guess from a professional perspective, it is the ultimate challenge. It's the one that you look at and go, we could do this better, right? You know you could do this better. You know, I get to put my money where my mouth is, right? When you break it down, it's not difficult. There are pockets of excellence all over the world in many, many supply chains, but it's beautiful when you can get to bring the best that everybody else has strived really hard to achieve, and I can just cut and paste it and put it in one go. I mean, it's the ultimate cheat, right? But why not, right? There are a lot smarter people out there that have worked for many years to create what they've done, and I'm literally just lifting that and putting it in, and all in one go, which is fantastic. So, you know, again, thank you for everybody for doing all the hard work. I've just, you know, copied it, borrowed it, and it's working really well together.
Gary, a lot of people that listen to this will be procurement, supply chain professionals. You know, would you recommend a career, a role, some time in the public sector and the NHS on some of these supply chain challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say that because I said I enjoyed it, right? So I'm not going to say no, but we do a lot of stuff in the private sector and a lot of leading edge thinking in order to drive, you know, that better customer experience, a little bit more efficiency, get a little bit more out of the engine, because they're almost like finely tuned vehicles that, you know, a lot of the private sector supply chains. Here you can take a lot of that and make a massive impact by bringing in standard practice in industry, but bringing it in a way that can apply in an environment that really doesn't understand that as much. But it's about bringing it in a way that takes the organization with you. Can I give you one example? We brought in S&OP or IBP, if you like, which is an entirely new tool to this environment. But the adoption has been faster than anything I've ever seen. Once it's understood and they get behind it, the adoption of that as part of the normal way of running a supply chain and running a business has been great. And that's actually quite rewarding, because you spend most of your career relaunching that thing and trying to re-engage and re-energize. Here, because it's new, you know, once the purpose and the value of it is understood, everybody gets behind it. And that's fantastically rewarding too.
I think to that point, Gary, we as Officio wanted to say thank you to you and everyone that works in your team. Go back to the start, NHS frontline workers, clearly heroes, put themselves at the front line of this, but there was a whole bunch of people that had to turn up to that office, you know, in the dark days of the pandemic in order to get the PPE to them. And I think it's an extraordinary achievement and a story. And I think everyone that's worked on that deserves everyone's thanks. You know, sometimes with the media's attention on it, maybe that good news element doesn't come through, but I think it should. And I think we should all say thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned something we're not talked about yet. I think one of the things we're most proud of the program, and one of the things that gets referenced quite a lot, is how we pull the different groups together. I mean, again, in a crisis, you throw people at stuff, right? So if you think at the start of this crisis, we had about 700 in this cell. We're now just moving down to just over 200. And, you know, again, credit to the original people for allowing us to kind of step into that different phase. But you look at the mix, we've had people from central government, NHS, DHSC, different consultancies, people like me who are sat at home, interims, contractors. And I think one of the things we've done is we've got the best out of all of them. I'll go back to your start. You mentioned vaccines. You know, what did we do? As you know, as well as with Officio, but a number of people that set up the supply chain here, or the move part, as I mentioned before, flipped straight into vaccines. And they didn't start again. They just, back to my cut and paste thing, they took everything that we'd done here, from program management to setup to people and capability, and just flipped it straight in, which allowed that program to stand up really quickly. And then more importantly, not look too different to something that had just been hugely successful. There's no heroism in reinventing the wheel, right? The achievement is in delivering the results. And if somebody's already shown you how to do it, or if you've already learned once, there's no need to go do it a different way a second time, unless you think that's going to add more value. You know, vaccines has benefited massively from support from your guys, but also the people that worked alongside them at the same time. That's been great to see too.
Gary, thank you so much for your time in this conversation today. It's been fascinating. As I said, I genuinely think that the whole story of PPE has got to be one of the most fascinating, challenging, interesting in our industry. I can't imagine there'll be many scenarios like there have been in the last 12 months. So to speak to someone that's been at the centre of that has been a privilege. So we really appreciate it. Appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
No worries. My pleasure.